September 1st, 1983. High above the Sea of Japan, a Soviet fighter was closing in on a Boeing 747. Inside that passenger jet were 269 people. The aircraft was Korean Airlines Flight 007, flying from Anchorage towards Seoul. But something had gone terribly wrong. Instead of following its assigned route over international waters, the 747 had drifted deep into Soviet-controlled airspace. Near Sakhalin Island, a Soviet interceptor moved into firing position. Ground controllers believed the aircraft posed a threat. Then came the order. Fire. 2 air-to-air missiles were launched. But how did a civilian passenger jet end up here? The answer began hours earlier, with a navigation error that nobody in the cockpit appeared to notice. Flight 007 had started in New York, then stopped in Anchorage to refuel, before continuing toward South Korea. The North Pacific route was unforgiving. To the south, the normal civilian corridor. To the north, Soviet territory. Kamchatka, the Sea of Okhotsk, Sakhalin. And in 1983, these were some of the most sensitive areas of the Cold War. American reconnaissance aircraft regularly operated near Soviet borders. Soviet radar stations watched the region constantly. A civilian aircraft following the correct route would remain safely outside Soviet airspace. But soon after leaving Anchorage, Flight 007 began drifting north. At first, the error was small. Then it became larger and larger. The Boeing 747 used an inertial navigation system, or INS, to follow programmed waypoints across the ocean. But its autopilot also had a simpler setting, called heading mode. In heading mode, the airplane simply maintained a selected compass direction. Investigators later concluded that Flight 007 most likely never successfully transitioned from heading mode to INS navigation. Either the crew forgot to make the switch, or they selected INS only after the aircraft had already moved too far away from the programmed route for the system to capture it. Either way, the 747 continued flying roughly the same magnetic heading, and the crew apparently believed the aircraft was following the correct route. It wasn't. That was what made the error so dangerous. The jet did not suddenly turn toward the Soviet Union. It drifted there, slowly. The crew continued making normal radio calls. They discussed weather, fuel, altitude. Nothing on the cockpit recording suggested they knew they were hundreds of miles from where they thought they were. Eventually, Flight 007 crossed the Kamchatka Peninsula. Soviet radar detected the unknown aircraft. Fighters were scrambled, but the interception failed. The 747 continued across the Sea of Okhotsk. For a time, it was outside Soviet land territory again. Then, it approached Sakhalin Island. The same wrong course carried the aircraft back into Soviet airspace. This time, the Soviet air defense system was ready. A Su-15 interceptor was guided toward the Boeing. The fighter pilot approached the enormous aircraft at night. He could see its navigation lights. He could see its shape. But Soviet commanders were operating under intense Cold War suspicion. An unidentified aircraft had already crossed sensitive military territory, and they did not know why. The interceptor attempted to signal the aircraft. Accounts describe warning cannon fire and other efforts to attract attention. But there is no evidence the Korean crew understood that a Soviet fighter was nearby. Inside Flight 007, the flight still seemed routine. Around the same time, the 747 requested permission to climb to a higher altitude. That climb caused it to slow. To the Korean crew, this was normal airline procedure, but to the Soviet interceptor behind them, it may have appeared suspicious. Now another factor became critical. Flight 007 was approaching the edge of Soviet airspace. Beyond Sakhalin lay international waters. If Soviet forces did nothing, the aircraft would soon escape. The interceptor was ordered into position. The command was given to destroy the target. The fighter locked on to the Boeing 747. Inside the passenger aircraft, nobody knew missiles were about to be launched. Then, the Soviet pilot fired. 2 missiles raced toward Flight 007. Their warheads detonated near the aircraft. The 747 was badly damaged, the cabin rapidly decompressed. But the airplane did not explode instantly. It remained in the air. Inside the cockpit, oxygen masks went on. The crew attempted to descend. Radio calls indicated a decompression emergency. The engines were still producing power. For several minutes, the Boeing continued flying, but the damage was severe. Eventually, the aircraft entered a steeper descent toward the sea near Sakhalin and Moneron Island. The radar return disappeared. There was no successful emergency landing, no rescue, no survivors. All 269 people aboard were killed. 246 passengers, 23 crew members. The shootdown immediately became an international crisis. The United States accused the Soviet Union of knowingly destroying a civilian passenger plane. The Soviet Union initially resisted accepting responsibility, then argued that the intrusion was connected to American intelligence operations. Washington rejected that claim. For years, the exact reason Flight 007 had wandered so far from its route remained surrounded by suspicion and conspiracy theories. One of the biggest reasons was that the most important evidence was missing. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder had been recovered by the Soviet Union, but they were not given to international investigators at the time. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed. In the early 1990s, the recorder material was finally provided to investigators. ICAO reopened the investigation, and the evidence supported an accidental navigation deviation. Investigators found no proof that the crew deliberately entered Soviet airspace. No cockpit discussion revealed a spy mission. The most likely explanation was much simpler. A navigation mode had not been properly verified. The aircraft drifted off course, and the crew failed to recognize it. KAL-007 also had consequences, far beyond aviation. After the disaster, the United States announced that the developing Global Positioning System, GPS, would eventually be made available for civilian use. GPS already existed as a military program. Flight 007 did not create it, but the tragedy helped accelerate the decision to open satellite navigation to civilian users. Today, that technology guides aircraft, ships, cars, and smartphones around the world. Korean Airlines Flight 007 is remembered as a Cold War shootdown, but the deeper lesson is how several failures combined. A navigation mistake went undetected. A civilian jet entered forbidden airspace. A military defense system interpreted that aircraft through the fear and suspicion of the Cold War. Attempts at communication failed, and commanders chose to fire. 269 people paid the price. But perhaps the most frightening part is how ordinary the beginning was. No explosion, no sabotage, no dramatic emergency. Just a passenger plane, slowly drifting away from where everyone believed it was, until it crossed an invisible line and entered the Cold War.